I asked my husband for an open marriage while he was deployed because I deserved more. Slept with other men anyway, when he refused, and now that I got caught on a date, my own family is helping him divorce me. My husband Ryan and I have been married for 9 years. We don't have kids by choice. We've always been that couple people describe as solid, not flashy, not dramatic, but stable. He's disciplined, structured, and dependable. I'm more emotional, more social, more expressive. It worked because we balanced each other, or at least it did when we were physically in the same place. Ryan was deployed overseas 8 months ago. I knew deployment would be hard. I'm not naive. I knew it would be lonely, stressful, and isolating. What I don't think people understand unless they've lived it is how slow the erosion is. It's not one big betrayal or fight. It's the constant absence, the time difference, the calls that get shorter because he's exhausted or operating on adrenaline, the texts that become logistical instead of intimate, the way your life keeps moving while theirs is frozen in survival mode. At home, I was the one holding everything together. The house, the bills, the repairs, the endless quiet. Everyone praised me for being strong and supportive. No one asked how it felt to be married but functionally alone. I didn't stop loving Ryan, but the marriage started to feel thin, like something stretched too far. I tried to talk to him about it. Not constantly, not dramatically, but enough. I told him I felt lonely, that I felt like I was existing in his life instead of being part of it. His responses weren't cruel, but they were limited. He'd tell me he was doing his best, that deployment wasn't about feelings, that he just needed to get through it. I understood that intellectually. Emotionally, it felt like I was being told to wait indefinitely while my needs sat on a shelf. That's where the resentment started. I hated that I was expected to be faithful, supportive, emotionally available, and grateful, while my own emotional needs were essentially on pause. I started thinking things I'm not proud of, but I'm going to be honest here because that's the whole point. I started thinking, I deserve to feel wanted. I started thinking that love shouldn't feel like deprivation. I started thinking that monogamy under these conditions felt less like commitment and more like obligation. So yes, I asked Ryan for an open marriage while he was deployed. I didn't frame it as cheating. I didn't frame it as betrayal. I framed it as honesty. I told him I didn't want to lie. I told him I didn't want to sneak around. I told him I wanted transparency and boundaries and rules. I told him this wasn't about replacing him, but about surviving the distance without becoming resentful or numb. He did not take it well. He was hurt. He was angry. He was shocked. He told me it felt like I was asking permission to abandon him while he was already in a vulnerable position. He said it made him feel disposable. He said if I needed other people to get through deployment, then maybe I didn't value the marriage the way he did. And he said no, clearly, firmly, no open marriage, no negotiation, no gray area. Here's where people will probably decide I'm irredeemable, but I'm still going to explain my mindset because it matters. His refusal felt unrealistic to me. It felt like he was prioritizing an ideal over reality. It felt selfish. I had just been honest about struggling, and instead of working with me, he shut the door completely. I told myself that I had done the right thing by asking, that if he refused to compromise, he was choosing rigidity over my well-being. I didn't suddenly decide, I'm going to cheat. What happened was slower and uglier. I started reframing. I told myself that monogamy during long-term deployment was unfair. I told myself that emotional starvation wasn't a requirement of loyalty. I told myself that I was still coming home to him, still married, still committed in the ways that mattered. I convinced myself that physical intimacy without emotional attachment didn't threaten the marriage. So I crossed the line anyway. I started seeing other men discreetly, nothing serious, no emotional entanglements, just dates, sex, companionship. I rationalized the secrecy as protection. Ryan was already under stress. Why burden him with information he couldn't do anything about? I told myself I would stop before he came home. I told myself this was temporary, a coping mechanism, a pressure valve. I never thought I'd get caught. I was wrong. I was out on a date with someone I'd been seeing casually when someone recognized me. Not a stranger, someone connected to Ryan. I don't even know the exact chain of events, but the information reached him quickly. Screenshots, times, enough proof that denial wasn't an option. When he confronted me, I didn't lie. I admitted it. I admitted I'd been seeing other men. I admitted it had gone further than just emotional validation. I expected anger. I expected yelling. What I didn't expect was silence. Ryan shut down completely. No emotional reaction, no debate, no attempt to understand my reasoning. He told me that trust was gone, that I had made choices knowing his answer, that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a lapse but a series of deliberate decisions, and he told me he was filing for divorce. I honestly thought he was bluffing. He wasn't. What blindsided me even more was my family's reaction. I expected support. I expected at least neutrality. Instead, my mother told me my behavior was humiliating, not just to Ryan, but to the family. She said I had embarrassed us. My sister Erin went even further. She helped Ryan find a lawyer. She told me flat out that what I did was calculated, not accidental. I cannot describe how surreal it feels to have your own family side with your spouse against you, to feel like everyone rewrote the narrative without you. I kept saying the same thing over and over. I was honest about my needs. I didn't hide my dissatisfaction. I tried to handle this openly. Why does none of that count? I feel abandoned on every front, by my husband, by my family, by people who claim to understand nuance but suddenly see everything in black and white. I'm not saying I handled this perfectly. I'm not saying I didn't make mistakes, but the punishment feels disproportionate. Divorce, estrangement, total rejection. So I'm asking here because I genuinely don't understand anymore. If I was honest about wanting more and he refused to compromise, why am I the villain for doing what I needed to survive? Update 1. Within days of confronting me, Ryan filed for divorce. Not a trial separation, not counseling, not space. Divorce. Papers served through an attorney. The first time I saw his name after everything broke, it was on legal letterhead. That alone should tell you how final his decision was. Any illusion I had that this was still a conversation evaporated instantly. Communication dropped to almost nothing. No calls, no texts, everything went through lawyers. Cold, transactional, efficient. I kept waiting for the emotional explosion, the moment where he'd ask why or demand explanations or at least express anger. It never came. That silence was worse than yelling. It felt like being erased while still technically married. I tried reaching out anyway. I sent messages explaining myself again, more carefully this time. I told him I never meant to hurt him. I told him the open marriage request came from desperation, not malice. I told him I still loved him. None of it got a response. Eventually, my attorney told me bluntly that further attempts at contact could complicate things. Hearing someone else tell me to stop talking to my own husband felt surreal. At the same time, my family drew lines I didn't see coming. I assumed wrongly that I could at least stay with my mother for a bit while things settled. I showed up with a bag and a plan to talk it through. She didn't even invite me in. She told me she loved me, but she wasn't going to enable what she called deliberate betrayal. She said what I did wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness, but a series of choices made after being told no. Her exact words were, "You asked. He answered. You decided his answer didn't matter." I don't think I've ever felt that judged in my life. My sister Erin was even worse. She didn't pretend neutrality. She told me straight up that she was helping Ryan because someone needed to protect him. She said my behavior was premeditated, that I didn't just cheat. I planned around his absence. That stung more than I expected, because in my mind, planning had meant minimizing damage. To her, it meant intent. I tried to argue that Ryan had abandoned me emotionally first. That deployment wasn't an excuse to stop being present as a husband. That loyalty shouldn't require emotional starvation. Erin shut that down immediately. She told me that being lonely didn't give me ownership over someone else's boundaries. That marriage didn't come with a clause that allowed me to override his consent when it became inconvenient. Hearing that from my own sister felt like being ganged up on. It didn't feel like accountability. It felt like betrayal. I kept thinking, why is everyone acting like I committed some unforgivable crime instead of acknowledging that I tried to be honest first? Socially, things started to collapse in quieter ways. I noticed people stopped responding to messages. Group chats went silent. Invitations I used to receive just didn't arrive anymore. No one confronted me directly, but I could feel the distance solidifying. The story had clearly traveled, and not in a flattering way. I went from being someone people sympathized with during deployment to someone they quietly avoided. That's when I doubled down internally. I told myself Ryan abandoned me first. I told myself that loyalty without intimacy was hollow. I told myself that I was being punished for refusing to martyr myself to an ideal that didn't meet my needs. I framed his silence as emotional cowardice. I framed my family's reaction as moral grandstanding. I clung to the idea that if they would just listen to my full reasoning, they'd understand. Then Ryan sent one final message. It wasn't long. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't cruel. It was devastating because of how calm it was. He said that trust didn't die when I asked for openness. It died when I chose secrecy after hearing his answer. He said deployment didn't excuse infidelity any more than loneliness excused betrayal. He said he didn't hate me, but he no longer trusted me, and that meant there was nothing left to rebuild. And then he asked that I respect his boundary and stop contacting him. That was it. No opening for dialogue, no invitation to explain myself again. Just a closed door. That's when panic set in. I realized I had wildly underestimated the consequences. I thought asking for an open marriage meant I was doing the ethical thing, even if he refused. I thought that honesty at the start would soften the fallout later. I didn't account for the fact that honesty without consent still equals betrayal. I didn't realize how quickly trying to survive could look indistinguishable from cruelty to the people watching from the outside. I started to feel genuinely isolated, not misunderstood in a dramatic sense, but actually alone. No spouse, no family support, no social buffer, just me and the reality that my explanations weren't landing anywhere the way they did in my head. I sent messages to my family trying to clarify myself. I didn't grovel, but I didn't attack either. I explained my loneliness. I explained my reasoning. The responses, when I got them at all, were short and firm. They weren't interested in intent. They were focused on impact. That was a pattern I couldn't ignore anymore. I'm not writing this update to say I suddenly see everything clearly or that I've transformed overnight. I still believe emotional neglect matters. I still believe deployment marriages need more honest conversations about needs. But I'm starting to understand something that makes me deeply uncomfortable. Asking for permission doesn't make you honest if you ignore the answer. I thought doubt, loneliness, and resentment were feelings I was allowed to have privately. I didn't realize I'd made my husband and my family pay for how I handled them. Final update. The divorce is finalized. There's no dramatic ending to that sentence. No twist, no last-minute plea or realization that changes anything. It happened the way everything else has happened since this blew up. Efficiently, quietly, and without me in the room. Assets were divided exactly as the paperwork predicted. No drawn-out fights, no emotional negotiations. Ryan didn't contest anything beyond what he needed to secure a clean break. I didn't get closure conversations or symbolic gestures. I got a signed agreement and a notification that it had been filed. That was it. 9 years reduced to legal language and a timeline. There was never an attempt at reconciliation from his side. I know people love to believe that time softens things, that distance creates reflection and longing. That didn't happen here. Ryan never wavered. Once he decided the marriage was over, I ceased to be part of his future planning entirely. I wasn't an option to reconsider or a mistake to revisit. I was something he moved past. What surprised me more than the divorce itself was how completely my family remained on the other side of it. I kept waiting for the moment where my mother would call and say, "Okay, this has gone far enough." It never came. She told me plainly that what I did fractured trust in a way she couldn't pretend didn't matter. Not just with Ryan, but with her. She said she raised me to understand consent, commitment, and honesty, and that I broke all three while insisting I deserved credit for trying. That sentence still sits with me, uncomfortable and sharp. My sister Erin hasn't softened either. She didn't gloat or lecture. She just stepped back. Our conversations are sparse and careful now, like we're both afraid of saying the wrong thing. At one point, she told me that helping Ryan wasn't about choosing him over me, it was about refusing to normalize what I did. That was harder to hear than anger would have been. Anger implies emotion. This was principle. It finally hit me that the betrayal didn't stop at my marriage. I didn't just break vows to my husband. I put my family in a position where they felt complicit if they stayed silent. I forced them to pick between enabling me or standing by their values. They chose the latter, and that choice stuck. Therapy wasn't my idea. It was suggested by more than one person, and eventually I went because everything else had been stripped away. I expected validation, or at least a balanced perspective. What I got instead was a steady dismantling of the narrative I'd been living inside. The first thing my therapist challenged was my use of the word honest. I kept saying I was honest because I asked for an open marriage. She pointed out, calmly and repeatedly, that honesty doesn't override consent, that asking a question doesn't grant permission to act against the answer, that framing my behavior as, "at least I tried to do it the right way," was a way of avoiding responsibility for what came after. She also introduced a concept that made me deeply uncomfortable, that consent applies inside relationships too, not just to sex, but to boundaries, agreements, and expectations. Ryan said no, clearly, Repeatedly, I treated that no as a temporary obstacle rather than a definitive boundary. I acted unilaterally, then acted shocked when unilateral decisions had unilateral consequences. I resisted that framing at first. Hard. I argued that marriage requires compromise. That needs change. That deployment is not a normal circumstance. All of that can be true, she said, and still not justify what I did. Context explains behavior. It doesn't excuse it. The most painful part wasn't realizing I cheated. I already knew that, even if I avoided the word for a long time. The most painful part was realizing why I did it. I told myself I wanted honesty. What I actually wanted was validation. I wanted to feel desired without feeling constrained. I wanted Ryan to absorb discomfort so I wouldn't have to sit with mine. When he refused, I reframed his boundary as neglect so I could step over it without guilt. I deserve more became a shield I used to justify behavior I didn't want to interrogate too closely. I also had to confront something uglier. I didn't want Ryan's consent nearly as much as I wanted his tolerance. I wanted him to accept pain quietly, so I could keep both my marriage and my escape. When he didn't, I treated that as abandonment instead of self-respect. That realization didn't come with relief. It came with grief. Not the dramatic kind, but the heavy, grinding kind that shows up when there's no one left to argue with. When the story you've been telling yourself stops working and there's nothing underneath it yet. I did reach out to Ryan once more after the divorce was finalized, not to reconcile, but to acknowledge what I hadn't acknowledged properly before. I kept it short. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't explain myself. I told him I understood now that asking didn't give me the right to ignore his answer, and that I was sorry for the harm I caused. He responded politely, briefly, and with finality. He said he appreciated the acknowledgement, but he was at peace and wished me well. That was the last message we'll ever exchange. There was no release in that moment. No closure arc, just an understanding that peace doesn't require forgiveness, and forgiveness doesn't require access. I'm not writing this to absolve myself. I still bristle when people reduce everything to a single word like cheater and stop there. I still believe emotional neglect is real and damaging. I still believe deployments strain marriages in ways people underestimate. But I no longer believe those truths give anyone the right to rewrite consent or outsource the consequences of their choices. I thought honesty at the beginning should count for something. What I understand now is that honesty without respect is just a warning label, not a virtue. I asked for more, was told no, and chose to act anyway. Everything that followed flowed directly from that decision. I don't expect my family to trust me the way they did before. I don't expect Ryan to ever see me as anything other than someone from his past. I'm not looking for redemption here. I'm looking at reality as it is. I wanted to survive my loneliness. Instead, I burned down the structures that gave my life stability. That wasn't inevitable. It was a choice, and no amount of intention changes that.